All right, so welcome back anyone who was here earlier. Welcome for anyone who is new joining us. My name is Emily R. Douglas. I'm going to be the chair for this session. So I am I guess, early 30s non-binary person with sort of red blonde hair and glasses and a brown shirt, and I'm sitting in a kind of messy home office here. So I'm really excited today to be introducing to you Grace Serrero. So Grace uses she or they pronouns. And Grace is currently a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Minnesota. Prior to this, Grace studied their bachelor's at Mount St. Mary's University. And Grace specializes in social political philosophy, epistemology, law, and public philosophy. So I read, Grace has done 2 previous interviews with Shelley over the last few years that I highly recommend you take a look at. And today, Grace will be talking to us about philosophy's reasonableism, which is reason/ableism in the title. Philosophy's reason-ableism, justificatory norms, and cloaked intersectional harms to disabled philosophy graduate students. So it's off to you, Grace. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here. I identify as she, they pronouns, and I am in my dining room with a lovely plant behind me, wearing a black turtleneck, glasses, and I have brown hair that's medium length. Thank you so much for having me today. And I apologize for the title of my talk is so long. So what I'm going to do is break it down into each piece. First, I'm going to talk about philosophy's reason-ableism and the reason why I decided to use reasonableism and separate ableism out in that word. Then I will quickly talk about justificatory norms in the discipline, and then I will talk on the ground a little bit about cloaked harms, intersectional harms to disabled philosophy graduate students variously situated. So, all right, to begin, I'm going to talk about very briefly what we think reason might be. Briefly, because who knows what it is, right? It's kind of like when a student asks you, what is philosophy? Well, what I'm going to say is, in the context in which I speak, I'm talking about who is justified in making a claim to social entitlements. So I'm thinking of reason, practical reason on the ground. What criteria do we have for those who make such claims to equality? Oppressed groups often make claims to equal rights, equal treatment, various, but who may make these just claims to these social entitlements? So in this context, I speak of reason and what's reasonable. I'm going to give an example of, tired example, but I'll give it anyway, of reasonable accommodations for students, for example. And the definition allows for a lot of latitude, and it transfers power onto the decision makers on the ground. So, for example, in the definition, accommodations are considered reasonable, quote unquote, if they do not create an undue hardship or a direct threat. So it can come in many forms. To determine what is reasonable, an employer must look at the request made by the applicant or employee with a disability. And whether or not an accommodation is reasonable will vary according to the position the employee holds, the way their disability affects their ability to do their job, and the environment that they work in. So, and then there's a variety of examples that in the US, the ADA lists as possible accommodations. But I want to talk about what justifies what justifies this decision as being something that is reasonable. So on the ground, we have a disabled student who requests accommodations, or in certain cases, you've got an employer who goes to their disabled employee and initiates the conversation. How can we accommodate you? When it comes down to who gets to decide, when we look at the demographics of who is in power, what we have is a situation in which, well, in philosophy in particular, a group of non-disabled philosophers are in power, and they decide what is reasonable to provide as an accommodation. So let's take into account for philosophy what this indicates. Demographics of philosophy indicate that most likely the philosophers in power who make these decisions are white, elite. They haven't known what it is to go hungry, most likely. They're non-disabled. And since I think, where are we at now? Maybe 21% of faculty in philosophy are women. So we can say that it's likely that we have this group of people who are making decisions. But I want to think about how it is that they can determine what is reasonable for a disabled person. And this is why I broke off ableism in reasonableism, because there are norms in philosophy that are grounded in ableist values. And so how is it that they can justify denying or awarding accommodations to a disabled philosopher? So this is what's my primary concern. And when we talk about justificatory norms in philosophy, we think about what is typically expected of a philosophy graduate student. Between in the US, you have teaching responsibilities, and you also have, well, you're supposed to try to get a few things out there to publish, and of course do your seminars and coursework and all these things. Now, I think across the pond there, you don't have coursework, I believe, in the PhD, which I think is a great setup. You can focus on your research. So when we think about justificatory norms for what philosophers in power would decide would be a reasonable accommodation for a philosophy graduate student, we need to think about what the values that are embodied in philosophy, what the role of those values are. So, now I'm going to turn here to just a general conversation about the answer to this question: who may make just claims to social entitlements? And historically, it's been based on only those who are rational or productive. That's the answer to the question. If you are not rational or productive, then you aren't justified in making claims to social entitlements. So we have what we have here, and I'm going to quote Serene Cotter from her article entitled Cognitive Disability, Capabilities, and Justice. She says the political and moral resonance of these justifications for inclusion reveals the degree to which the liberal political tradition associates moral worth with the values of autonomy, rationality, reciprocity, and productivity. So, pardon me. So where does this leave a disabled Phil grad, for example? Well, someone who's a Phil grad with cognitive disabilities may not have disabilities that are evident immediately, and the expectations for them may be informed by biases about appearances. So that's one thing that we can think about. So while there may be an expectation for, I'll just pick one of these, reciprocity and two of these, reciprocity and productivity. So there's an expectation of reciprocity and productivity. The program has expectations of the disabled philosophy graduate student, for example, that they will be able to contribute to the department and produce certain things. And those are based on what the non-disabled group of philosophers in power believe are reasonable. But recall, reasonable includes ableist values and ideals that are long entrenched in philosophy. So this can be a problem when you have a disconnect between what the disabled philosophy graduate student coming into a program, trusting that they will be cared for come what may, including the COVID-19 global pandemic and mandatory quarantine. So there's a disconnect between what the program would expect from the graduate student and what the disabled graduate student may be able to produce or give back to the program. So this can create an issue if the disabled philosophy graduate student requests accommodations, which the people who make decisions in the department don't believe are reasonable based on their ableist values and ideals. So let me go down here. So we have an idea of what we're thinking about reasonable and what these ideals are. And the main question we have is, on the ground, who decides what is reasonable and based on what? And the problem is, how might they reason what is reasonable for a disabled person? So I'm going to take a look at Serene Carter's work that I quoted from earlier, Cognitive Disability, Capabilities, and Justice. And inspired by the work of Eva Katay and Lawrence Becker, Serene posits three criteria for any theory of justice that sufficiently takes the needs of cognitively disabled people seriously. So she says that there are 6 things that this theory of justice needs to have. And remember, what we're doing is we're offering justification for a person who requests social goods. What justifies them in asking for this? So the first criteria is it needs to understand that cognitively disabled people are oppressed. The second is it needs to posit a single standard of what is owed to cognitively disabled individuals. The third is it needs to be concerned with flourishing as well as political liberty and freedoms. And the fourth is it should refuse to see cognitively disabled people as less than human. The fifth, it should value moral powers other than practical reason. And last, it should secure space for care and dependency relationships. So the end of social distribution is valued capabilities. It's an evaluative thing. So for this to happen, we need a new conception of what is owed to persons and what are capabilities for, and what is the aim of capability equality. Serene departs from Martha Nussbaum's theory of capabilities and Elizabeth Anderson's theory of capabilities of based on justice. In that, she says, evaluative spaces based upon teleological accounts of what is normal for the human species, or accounts of the citizen exclusively as participant in public realms of reciprocity, insufficiently incorporate people who are cognitively disabled. For a capabilities approach to meet the last three criteria, which were refuse to see cognitively disabled people as less than human, value moral powers other than practical reason, and to secure space for care and dependency relationships, we must think, she says, of a new evaluative space. And that space is called relational agency. Now, I could talk for a while about agency itself, but I don't believe I have time. So the notion of relational agency evaluates what the capabilities are for, as such, sustaining agency and relationship. That's what the relational agency approach accomplishes. And so going back to our list of the criteria of the theory of justice that sufficiently takes the needs of cognitively disabled people into account. We have the relational agency approach sees most cognitively disabled people as capable of agency and relationship. As far as the valuing moral powers other than practical reason, the relational agency approach says being in relation with others is a very important moral power. It's not substandard to practical reason. And finally, to secure space for care and dependency relationships, the relational agency approach ensures space for relationship is central. So you see where we have values, not necessarily flipped, but we have values inserted and also placed on the same level as the values of what did we have? Autonomy, rationality, reciprocity, and productivity. The primary liberal political tradition which associates moral worth with those values. Those are the values that usually are thought of in the liberal tradition. So on this view, I'm just going to call it relational agency view of justification. Okay, we see a difference in expectations with regard to reciprocity, productivity, rationality, and autonomy. Reciprocity is something different when you value the relationship that a person who is cognitively disabled can participate in. And the same is true for productivity. If we value the relationship over the productivity rate, we can see value of the person in a different way, and they are justified in making a claim to social entitlements. So let me see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, I have a few more minutes. So with the view now of the relational agency approach as a different justificatory norm in philosophy, I'm going to narrow it down to the discipline now and narrow it down further to justificatory norms for decisions based on giving reasonable accommodations to disabled philosophy graduates. So we have said the decision makers in power are likely non-disabled, and our discipline has championed ableist values for as long in history as I have been able to dig. So what are some of those ableist values? Speed is one of those. So if the expectation of the group of people in power who are making decisions, if the expectation is that a graduate student ought to be able to accomplish X in Y amount of time, but they're only taking into account what they know of what philosophers do throughout their lifetime and previously, they're going to make a judgment which by their lights is reasonable. However, it doesn't take into account the situated experience of being a disabled person and being a disabled philosophy graduate with all the contingencies that come with it. Furthermore, we have a situation in which too often there's a conflation of X things happen to a disabled person, sometimes, just as a result of their existing while disabled or being a student while disabled. These certain things happen from time to time, but that's often conflated with the idea that, well, only X type of thing happens to people who are deficient in moral character. So what we have is this conflation of deficiency in moral character with things that are simply entailed by being disabled. And so if you have faculty who aren't engaged in a relationship with a Phil grad student, such that they would ask, is everything okay? What happened this morning? You may have fallen in, well, where I live, you might have slipped on the icy steps or whatever, which if you're disabled can really disrupt your whole day. So without that relationship and without valuing the relational agency of the disabled Phil grad, what we have is this judgment about their moral character that is incorrect. So I want to talk about this in terms of structural injustice and ways in which departments may or may not promote relational agency as being the standard for justification for their Phil grads accommodations or not. One thing that is apparent is a lack of transparency in processes and procedures within departments. I know that APA has been working very hard to encourage departments to develop transparent processes. However, on the ground, I know that that hasn't happened necessarily. And so there's no communication between the people in power who are making decisions and the disabled field grad who may know a little bit about what's going on, but they are mostly in the dark about what decisions are being made about them and their work and their future, which affects everything in their career going forward. But without having a conversation, without having a chance to give a response to whatever answer has been given by the people in power regarding an accommodation, without having an opportunity to give a response, the field grad is left in a very vulnerable position, depending on what decision has been made about them and their work and their future. At times, this can cause such harm that, for example, if you have a field grad who has mental illness, it may affect them such that they're not able to do their work. And the work may be what's being demanded of them to stop the harm. So they're stuck in a loop without hope and without an avenue of communication in which they are heard. And so they lack relational agency because of the values of the people in power in their department. And it can not only risk their career, but it can risk their lives often as well. And this, the extent of the harm varies. It varies variously situated. Field grads can be harmed, for example, by COVID and the illness itself, and situations relating to the pandemic and the mandatory quarantine. So this is where we see a variety, and I call it intersectional harms, because variously situated field grads are disproportionately harmed for their identity or for their being disabled, or, for example, their being a disabled mother, or if they have a disabled child. Mandatory quarantine in my case, as the disabled mother who's also a philosophy PhD student, and I also have a son who's autistic and a young daughter in elementary school who has ADHD. So during the mandatory quarantine, we are all at home, and it was extremely difficult and painful, and especially the effect on my autistic son. His mental health deteriorated over time. The longer the quarantine lasted, the more difficult it became. And it was constant, hypervigilant crisis care for him. So had I known this situation was going to occur, I would have taken a leave of absence for the, I would have said, okay, I'll just take a leave of absence for the whole pandemic. But of course, we didn't know at the time, how long the mandatory quarantine was going to last. I didn't know that I was going to get COVID, and turned out to be long-lasting. The brain fog that I experienced for about a year was devastating, but I kept trying. but I fell behind. So at the same time that some of my colleagues who are not disabled, or maybe disabled but not moms, or maybe moms but without a disabled child, all these various situations, while my colleagues who are non-disabled moved ahead on their PhD program timeline for their milestones, I fell behind, which is associated with an enormous amount of shame. And as much as I tried, until the quarantine was lifted, it was really, really difficult to do work for any extended period of time. And your philosophers say, how we need our quiet time, and we need time is what we need. So, so when we talk about these intersectional harms, the decision makers in power, who are likely non-disabled and have these values that privilege non-disabled field grads, without taking into account what's reasonable based on the relational agency approach of justification for asking for social entitlements. In this case, the opportunity, the time after the pandemic's over to finish all my papers in progress and catch up. It can harm immensely. So this is where I want to draw to a close. I think I have a few more minutes, but I'm just going to recap quickly. The reason I say reason ableism is due to what is typically thought of as justifiable in giving accommodations to students in philosophy. So these justificatory norms value autonomy, rationality, reciprocity, productivity, and only those who are rational or productive are justified in laying claim to social entitlements. So the problem then is, how is a group of non-disabled philosophers able to discern what is reasonable for a disabled person? And what I propose is Serene Carter's idea that we change what we use for our justificatory norm. So we have evaluative spaces based on teleological accounts of what is normal for the human species, or accounts of the citizen exclusively as a participant in public realms of reciprocity, insufficiently incorporate cognitively disabled persons. So we think of a new evaluative space, which Serene breaks down and calls relational agency, which meets the criteria for a theory of justice that sufficiently takes into account the needs of the cognitively disabled people, which are, they understand cognitively disabled people are oppressed. We posit a single standard of what is owed to cognitively disabled individuals. It's concerned with flourishing as well as political liberty. It refuses to see cognitively disabled people as less than human, values moral powers other than practical reason, and secures space for care and dependency relationships. And those values are central to the theory. So it looks like it's time for questions. And
all right. Yeah, anything last you want to say there, Grace?
I don't think so. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks, Emily.
I want to thank you so much for your talk. This gives me like so many tools and concepts to chew on, thinking about like both my own experiences as a disabled graduate student, and also those of my colleagues and peers in solidarity. So it's really, yeah, it's really rich. I will come back for a question later if there's space. So there's a first question from Amandine Catala. And Amandine says, thank you so much for your excellent talk. Regarding your point about so-called reasonable accommodations, I wonder if we could make some progress by shifting the language, for example, to adopt the expression about inclusion measures. There is much both positive and negative to be said about the waves of EDI or equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. But I wonder if saying inclusion measures could be a way to hold these EDI-driven institutions accountable to their own commitments.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. Yes, I really love this. There is, well, okay, on the one hand, it's really wonderful to see that it's on the radar of institutions. So that's good. On the other hand, without accountability, it's sometimes can feel like a slap in the face that everywhere you turn, there's publicity about the equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives going on at our university. My goodness, at least a dozen initiatives, whether at the provost level or the president's level, and they're all excellent. But it does not connect to what happens in departments, because departments have autonomy. So yes, I love this idea of talking about measures, and there are ways in which that can be done on a relational level. So in a vast university like University of Minnesota with 54,000 students, it demands manpower if it's not going to be AI, which AI gets everything wrong always. So what I want to say is it's nice to see at our university new positions actually of power dedicated to accountability of sorts. Now it's brand new, as in like just this September, these positions have been introduced. Nevertheless, it's nice to see, and it gives you some hope that the right things are on the radar of the people who are in power. But there is that gap between the people who are in power on the ground and the people up here who are involved in these initiatives. And so without that connecting, we can have a huge epistemic gap, but also a gap in justice and all sorts of things. So yes, so I like that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also thinking about this, like how to get the lower level of power to be held accountable to what the administrators and the provosts, right, say that this is what we're committed to. Absolutely. And Jonathan Wolf has a question, so he's going to come on camera to ask that.
Great.
Thanks very much, Grace. Really interesting for me, and as someone who spent, I don't know, close to 20 years, I think, as head of department or dean of faculty, and thinking about this from the other side. And I'm not sure if the issue ever actually came to my attention as something we needed to give special consideration to. But if it had come up, these three conditions from Serene Card are really interesting to think about. So the way you explain them, if I've got it right, the first one was that people with cognitive disability should be regarded as oppressed. The second is that there should be a single standard. And the third is we should pay attention to flourishing and not just political liberty. Now, the first and third, I absolutely understand. And I recently came across again Iris Marion Young's work, where she tries to link oppression and flourishing, or at least thriving, and which you can see in an Aristotelian frame as, you know, to be oppressed is to be under conditions in which you won't thrive or flourish. So I see those two going together very naturally. But what I would have thought they would have led to was pluralism rather than a single standard. So I'm not understanding, I think, why a single standard is there, because I would have thought that one just needs to make, you know, I mean, it's a very enlightening thing for me actually to think about, you know, what conditions does each person need to help them flourish as a philosopher. And I think if we pay attention to every one of our graduate students actually thinking about that, you know, what are the conditions that will make them flourish, not just as a human being or an individual, but as a philosopher. But why should that be a single standard? So that's my question. Sorry, a long question for a simple question inside.
Great question, and that was my initial question as well. And what we see is in switching to what Serene calls the relational agency approach, sustaining agency and relationship are our standard. So in valuing the relationship as central, in the relationship between just, for example, your academic advisor or director of graduate studies, whatever, if the relationship and sustaining that relationship and all the other, the 6 values that we have in our theory of justice, they enable you to take whatever unique needs your student has into account, because you primarily care about the relationship. So that's where it creates the space for you to do the individual things for your student. Does that get at it a little bit?
So the single standard isn't a single code, then.
Right.
It's more like a common approach. But yeah, I think I need to think about this more, because of course, you know, relationships matter, but even there, relationships matter more for some people than others.
Right.
And yeah, particularly in a philosophy community, we see some people who do their best work when they're left alone, and other people who need, you know, very regular stimulation. But anyway, I don't want to hog things. It's a fascinating start. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question. Yeah, I think that helps pull out, right, how you can have kind of a plurality of responses in one standard. That's really nice. So we have another question. This is from Kevin Selhe, and this goes towards some of the things that I was thinking as well. So Kevin says, thank you so much for your talk. Is there space to identify the ways many people in the field with power use a strategy of, quote unquote, strategically ignoring individuals with disabilities? Is there some responsibility for attention that we owe as philosophers to individuals with cognitive and other disabilities? So I've been thinking about, I'm going to add just like 2 lines because I'm the chair. I've been thinking about this in connection with kind of the attitude of surprise that seems to happen in my department every time somebody like foregrounds their disability, right, or needs an accommodation or has an emergency, right? It's never an awareness that there are already disabled philosophers there. So I think that keys into Kevin's question, right, about attention or ignoring. So I'd love to hear you talk on that.
Right. This is a great thing to point out. And I think that we can take a look at several of the criteria for the theory of justice here, right? So I think that attention ought to be paid in the same way that you would pay attention to a grad student who just happens to be, they just crank out papers right and left. Right? So if we value under the relational agency model here, you're concerned with your students flourishing as well as their freedom. You are refusing to see them as less than, and not just less than human, but less than able students. You may have a difference in productivity. That doesn't mean that one gets more attention than the other. So this calls into account the attention, the ratio of attention that you pay to your highly productive non-disabled students and your disabled students. I definitely agree. And also valuing moral powers other than practical reason in decision making about what kind of accommodations are reasonable for your students. So when you make this space so that the relationship is central, all these other things sort of and obligations that people in power have to their students are all fall out from there. And I believe one of those things is attention, particularly in regards to your academic advisors and as you're working on your products or your projects. Yeah, good. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, wonderful. So we have just a couple minutes left. I guess I'd just like to plumb some of more of your thoughts on how do we get departments to make this shift in their values, right? To take or adjust the ableism in reasonableism. I guess, yeah, so now I'm trying to brainstorm and think of so how could we get professors and departments to take this seriously? Do you have a kind of grassroots ideas or anything you've tried?
Well, so it's tough, and I think we all are aware of how difficult it is to have someone change their values. But I also think that if you have enough time and contribute in certain ways to a relationship with the people in power, if you have opportunity, that might be a way. And certainly I know there are a lot of well-meaning philosophers who may or may not have as much power as the others who really want to listen. We have that chair of our diversity committee, Valerie Tiberius, is one of those people. And, it's not something that can happen immediately. However, it is the case that administration holds power to put the measures in place for accountability, right? So, I mean, you could, in my view, I think it should be in all, sort of from all corners. But as far as if you're a Phil grad with no power, bewildered at what's, you can try to communicate in various ways, whether it's, here's the effect that this has had on me, or who knows, make up a thought experiment that you think they might get. I don't know. Yeah. So, yeah, it's, I think that definitely needs to be, bottom up from the unfortunately, when you're in the position of being oppressed, you end up doing a lot of work. But that's why you need this other group of administrators who can put measures in place. But yes, I wish I had more answers. How about you? Do you have any ideas?
I mean, I think it's the problem of our time. How do we get philosophers to change their minds? But we have reached time. So thank you again so much, Grace, for your really stimulating talk. I'm going to read things and think about things. So we have a 10-minute break, everybody, and then we come back, and our next session is a presentation by Joseph Stramondo. So very excited.
All right,
Thanks again.
Thanks.